Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? Let me introduce you to our panel today. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, the president of the First Amendment Partnership, an organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for all Americans of all faiths. Then we have Mr. Justin Giboney, an attorney, political strategist, and the co-founder and president of the AND campaign. And we have Mr. Vilo Weiss, who's the director of public affairs and religious liberty for the Conference of Indiana for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here and looking forward to our conversation today. You know, I want to talk about an interesting topic regarding the religious leanings that we may see from church organizations. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is one that seems to be leaning a lot more towards the Republican side. But then you have the African Methodist Episcopal Church that seems to be leaning a lot more, quote unquote, towards the Democratic side. You know, Pew Research has gone and done a lot of research in this area. And one of the issues that I've been looking at is the fact that many believe that most religious groups are really leaning towards the right. When in reality, if you look at churches like the Lutheran and the Methodist, they're a little bit more 50-50, and I think that would be a surprise for those. But the one that really threw me off kilter was that Jehovah's Witnesses going about 85% independent. You know, Justin, is there any rhyme or reason to where we're going with this, and whether or not maybe we talk so much about a religious right, but there's probably more powerful religious left that may be out there?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of diversity when it comes to our politics for people of faith. Some of those differences are based on theology, and so that can account for some of it. But some of it is cultural, people coming from different cultural contexts, even within the Christian community so this isn't new. For a long time, there's kind of been a racial divide in that regard, where you had folks who were for civil rights and those who weren't for civil rights. You had issues when it comes to racial justice in general. So these are things that I think should bring about a larger discourse, and to see how people even with the same similar theology, see politics so differently. And some of it is okay. I mean, even within a sound theological framework, there is room for us to disagree on how to approach different political issues, but certainly something worth looking at and taking the time to think through.
You know, Todd, but I got to ask you, even a religion, for example, like the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I think the majority of members probably think that it's leaning a lot more right. But when you look at the data, it's actually leaning a little bit more left. I mean, is that surprising, or is it just simply a fact that whoever gets the most information out there, or the loudest group, is where people think the numbers are really going?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on where you're looking, right? So if you're looking at certain other demographic characteristics, I think really dominate. So if you're talking about, white evangelical or white Seventh-day Adventist, then, you are, especially older, you are certainly looking at a lot more Republican leaning. But if you're looking at black, or Hispanic, then the numbers look a lot different. You also got to look at historical data, right? So historically, it used to be even more our leaning than it is now. So yeah, it is a lot more diverse than people think, but you can find examples, especially, with concentrated populations, that historically have been sort of supporting only one side.
You know, Tim, when I look at some of these organizations, for example, you take a look at the Anglican Church that seems to be leaning a little bit more to the Republican side, but then you have, the Orthodox Jews that seem to be leaning a little bit more Democrat. When you see where these different groups are going, whether it's their theology, whether it's something from a cultural standpoint, is this an area where really politicians can start to figure out where to actually make some hay?
I think politicians are going to more or less do what they have been doing. I don't know that there's a lot of nuanced thought there. I am heartened to see that the Democratic Party has started to take faith much more seriously, recognizing that faith is at the core of the lives of many people, including many people who are willing to vote for Democrats. But I agree also with Justin and Todd. I think a lot of this breaks down by race more than theology. You lots of times would have an evangelical church where people all kind of share the broad same sort of lowercase evangelical theology, not political theology, but they differ on political theology. And that those differences a lot of times are based upon racial differences. And I think that's not talked about enough.
Well, Vilo, even when we talk about things from a racial perspective, we're even starting to see that where you've got some diversity, even among race, that we still sometimes can't figure out what direction that these states are going in, and some of the directions that some of these religions are going in. I mean, if you take a look, for example, at the Jehovah's Witness, how could we even juxtapose getting to an idea that 85% of their denomination is leaning more independent? Or is that something that's showing more how independent they are as a religion?
It could be. There are the independent voter sector is becoming a very important sector, and that flip flops back and forth. The thing that is a little bit troubling to me as I look at groups that are historically a particular party. I vote for people based on what they stand for. I'm becoming more and more of an independent myself, and we can't put too much faith in politics because it usually ends up disappointing us, I think.
Well, it's interesting that we see, for example, we've got a senator from Georgia who is a Baptist preacher who actually won in a quote unquote very, I would say, conservative state in Georgia. To see that individual now moving into elective office and just being reelected, does that tell us that really the politics of religion is starting to bring even those from the religious faith involved? I mean, we've seen that in the House for quite a long time, but we're now starting to see it edge into the Senate a little bit. Justin, when you think about things like what happened with Warnock, I mean, where do you think that this is taking us from a religious standpoint?
That's a good question. Here you had two candidates who would consider themselves to be Christians, to be devout Christians, and took very different positions on issues. I don't know that religion played the main part in that race, though. I think it had a lot to do with what became really a poor candidate in Herschel Walker. And I think that was really the big X factor within the race. And so I don't know that we can take a whole lot from this. If you have a different candidate on the Republican side, things might have went a lot differently. But I will say this, something that surprised me was that a lot of progressives in Georgia didn't make a whole lot of hay about having a pastor as the candidate representing that party. Maybe there's something there. I think it's going to take more time for us to know exactly what this means because there were other factors to consider.
I got to ask you, Tim Schultz, when you take a look at some of these numbers, if you were out actually advising candidates or letting them know where they should be moving some of their, I would say, efforts, could you see that there may be an entree? You kind of mentioned that you're starting to see the Democrats think about faith a little bit differently. If you're advising candidates, is this an area that you would tell them you really need to take some time and put some energy into it?
Well, if I were advising Democratic candidates, I would note that the candidates who have made religion a more central part of their identity have done better in swing state races. And so having candidates that see faith as not a kind of toxin, but as something that's deep at the core of many of the voters or potential voters, that's something that I would advise them. On the Republican side, I would probably say that Latino voters, especially Latino voters that are religious, have started to move a little bit more toward the Republican Party, and that a lot of that is because of appeals to religion. And I would probably tell them to lean into that a little bit more. I'm glad that I'm not a political consultant. You've just made me go through a very difficult sort of wrenching process to imagine myself as such, Orland, but that is what I would advise if I had to take on that role.
Well, Todd, I got to ask you, though, when you see religion starting to get so intertwined with politics to the point where Pew Research can actually put where the political leanings are, and we see candidates now that are actually campaigning on there should be no separation of church and state. Is that an area that we should have some concerns with, and whether or not we should be thinking about this differently?
Yeah, I do. I mean, one of the reasons that the United States has sort of the level of religious freedom it does, and, sort of involvement is because religion historically hasn't taken one particular side of the spectrum. And you compare that to, say, France, right, where, while there was, heavily Catholic, secular society, there's the idea of laicity and secularism, and you had a very different experience with the interaction historically of religion and the state. In the United States, we've historically had that separation, we've had that neutrality, and the fact that religion is becoming more and more tied to, successful campaigns is not necessarily a good thing and can create some problems, for religious freedom moving forward. I do think the idea, though, that religion is being used more by, sort of a democratic side and energizing their base, and religious people on the sort of other side of what we've historically seen the last 15, 20 years is a good thing in that sense. So it's not just religion supporting one side.
And I think that's a critical point that we're starting to see. I think we're almost in a better balanced approach if you do have the situation where religion is not just supporting one side. But Viola, I got to ask you, if you're looking at where we're going to be moving in the future with this, one of the things I did find interesting is that the LDS Church actually had a larger percentage that was going Republican maybe 10 years ago. Highly in the 80s percentile and now moving down to the 70s. So one of the questions, it looks like, even though you may start out looking like you're more right, it seems like more and more religious groups seem to be actually pushing more into the middle. Have you been seeing anything along those lines as well?
I think so. And, perhaps Exhibit A is the fact that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was involved very much in the Utah Compromise, and in terms of working out things with the LGBTQ plus community, and I think that's a positive thing, and it's the direction that we need to go. We need to find middle ground that we can work together to build a better society.
Todd, you would think that with all these religious groups getting more involved, that we would start to possibly see a better dialogue or a more civil discourse happening in politics. I mean, it seems wherever we look, it doesn't matter whether it's religions or whether it's politics or whether it's a combination of the both, that the civil discourse that's going around as it relates to politics seems to be also in our churches. And it seems like that's an area that we should be of concern. Am I missing something there, or have you seen something similar?
No, it is. I mean, that is, one of the challenges, right, with not just having your political or civic views informed by your faith and religion, but believing that they're commanded, that there's only one way to vote or view an issue because of your religion, because, quite frankly, that does not move the ball forward towards either civil discourse or compromise. And politics is, to use the cliche, the art of the compromise, right? That is what a political process is supposed to do. And that's anthem to religion, which, is not about that. It's about, issues of ultimate truth and knowledge. And those two items are not particularly symbiotic, and I think have increased sort of the disagreements that we see in society.
Justin, I'm going to give you the last word on this. As it relates to civil discourse, as it relates to hopefully looking at things where if you are taking a religious perspective and involved in politics, that we can get to a point where we can just disagree, but not have to be disagreeable. Are you seeing ways in which we might even see some improvement from that standpoint as we get more religious groups involved in politics?
I wish I could say I was seeing things get better, but unfortunately, in many cases, people of faith, Christians in particular, have been part of the problem. I don't think we've necessarily taken what the Bible's said about peacemaking and not trading insult for insult seriously. I hope that at one point we do, that we can see that politics is very important, but it's not an ultimate thing, and have the moral imagination, which is what it's going to take to have a discourse with humility, hear people out, but even also fight with tenacity on the issues that we really care about.
I think that is something that we all need to be looking at, is the fact, how can we get to a point where we can find a moral compass where we can disagree and still not have to be disagreeable? The Supreme Court recently was dealing with a case that was called Yeshiva versus U-Pride Alliance, where the Supreme Court basically in a 5-4 majority was looking at what was going on with a modern Orthodox Jewish institution in Manhattan that was really pursuing a situation where they were trying to determine whether or not you could have an LGBTQ entity that could be involved in an activity there, and whether or not the institution actually had the power to, quote unquote, disassemble it or not allow it to move forward. Todd, could you tell us a little bit about what's going on with this case and where we're going? It seems like it's been bouncing back and forth, and not really sure where the direction may be on it.
Sure. So a group attempted to seek recognition from Yeshiva University, which was for LGBT students. Yeshiva University disallowed that group because of the university's belief regarding sexuality and morality. That was then challenged under a New York State non-discrimination law. Yeshiva University attempted to assert a religious exemption for that law. The challenge became that years ago, Yeshiva University had put themselves in as listed as a non-denominational entity because of some business tax reasons, if I understood it correctly. But they had made some filed stayings that had not been as overtly religious as they could be. And so even though there seems to be very little doubt that the school is religious, that it's run, it has a religious mission, it's controlled by a religious organization, it, teaches Jewish faith and tradition, and has all the other aspects of being religious you would expect, because of this one particular state filing, it is the state has said that they are entitled to the exemption. The case wound its way up to the Supreme Court on sort of an interim basis, but the Supreme Court said, hey, you need to take care of some state issues first. So they're back in the state court right now. So we're filming this in sort of early December. At this stage, the district court, the trial level court, has denied the exemption to Yeshiva, had ordered them to recognize this club. There was then an appeal to the appellate court. They agreed, the parties agreed to stay the judge's rulings. In other words, the judge's ruling is there, but Yeshiva University was not required to follow it, pending the outcome of the appeal. In the meantime, Yeshiva has created a Torah-compliant club for LGBT students, which my understanding about 20 students are participating in, but that is unlikely to satisfy the plaintiffs in this case. So we'll see the case wind its way up through to the New York State appellate court system. Quite frankly, and this is just my own personal, predictions, likely to lose through that. And then we may end up at the U.S. Supreme Court at some point after it's gone through the state court system.
Justin, I got to ask you, this is exactly what some people who have problems with religious organizations look at. They say they want to have their cake and they want to eat it too. Does this have a little bit of that context where you go out and you claim one side so that you can have some quote unquote business benefits, but then you want to come back and be on the other side when you want to make sure to protect yourself from a religious perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start off by saying I'm an attorney, not necessarily a constitutional scholar, but it's something that churches really have to pay attention to. These are serious. I mean, there's a reason, the separation between church and state, it has a purpose. And so when there are clear guidelines set, we need to make sure that we're following those guidelines, not to just get an advantage when it comes to taxes or an advantage somewhere else. I can't speak exactly to where that is on this particular case. It looks like they're still it's been remanded to figure out some of those facts and legal issues. But churches need to be aware that you got to pay attention, that status. If you want to maintain that status, you got to make sure that you're following the guidelines, because we do want to make sure that we're being consistent and truthful in how we move forward.
Tim Schultz, that consistency question is something that really is one of the best protections that we have when we're going out and fighting for religious organizations. When you look at a matter like this, does this consistency or inconsistency sometimes put us in a bad position down the road when we're trying to have conversations on protection of churches and their interests?
Well, I think that religious organizations are in a stronger legal and cultural position when they act consistently. That is, if, for instance, a school fires a gay teacher who's in a relationship that violates their understanding of sexuality, if they're not disciplining straight teachers who cheat on their wives and therefore violating the school's understanding of sexuality, that hypocrisy makes it much harder to defend legally and politically. So that's what I would say.
Well, Vilo, when you take a look at a case of this nature, and one of the things that I guess we have to ask ourselves is, if you want to be a religious organization and you hold yourself out in that form of fashion, maybe there should be some rule changes as it relates to tax consequences and business consequences, so that maybe that makes the whole process a little bit cleaner. What are your thoughts on that?
That would be very helpful. But even if that didn't happen, I would hope that a religious institution would still want to be a religious institution regardless of what it costs them. We need to be consistent to our core values.
And that's where I think we're kind of seeing the rub on this, Todd, the idea of the inconsistency. And, and you're an individual who sometimes is down on Capitol Hill and you're talking with leadership. And the thing that I think works probably to your advantage is not having those situations where they can come back and say, well, look, it looks like this religious group was just trying to personally benefit itself. If we're going to protect you because of what you believe, do you think that has any light on this?
Yeah, I think, the challenge here, right, is first of all, judging inconsistency is a judgment value really on a religious organization itself. We all have religious beliefs. I'm not going to pick on any other particular religion, but you can always point to a religion and say, hey, you do A, I think that means you have to do B, right? And that's not really for the government to decide. Tim gave a pretty clear example, right, of, sexual immorality between straight and same-sex couples. And that is, I think it's a good example, and it's one that most religions recognize as being inconsistent. But there's other things that churches do, as far as consistency, that, it's other people outside of religion, and especially governmental entities, shouldn't be determining what is and isn't consistent within a religion. And also, without getting into all the details of the state court filing, the landscape has changed considerably. And if I remember correctly, these filings were done decades ago, and no one really thought or understood that this was waiving any rights of religious organizations. The corporate status and corporate laws, and I've had to deal with this, often are not drafted in terms of religious organizations and nonprofits, and especially religious organizations don't fit a particular mold. And so you often find yourself having to sort of put a round peg in a square hole when it comes to corporate bodies if your ecclesiastical organization doesn't line up with whatever the state did when they weren't even thinking about religious organizations. So I think we got to be a little bit careful about being critical of religious organizations and consistency, because that's putting a lot of value judgment itself, and that's not really the job of government.
And and I think, Justin, that hits it right on the head, that consistency question and the role of government. Who gets to decide sincerity? Who gets to decide whether or not you're actually, quote unquote, adhering to your religious principles or not? That seems to be an area of focus that we have to be really keeping an eye on, because even when we get into the court systems, we find ourselves finding judges trying to make these determinations as well. But do you see any issues with that?
Yeah, I would say that significant inconsistencies can be probative. What they tell us is, do you really believe what you're saying? Let's keep in mind that this is in conflict with something else. We're not just saying that we're making these judgments based off nothing. We're making these judgments based off a tension with what other people would see as another right, or a tension with what someone might consider discrimination. So I think that the consistency is important. We do want to watch what, who makes the judgment, but it's in the courts. I mean, we live in a society where people outside of your religion do have some judgments to make if you're going to get certain privileges. So it does play a role. I'm with Todd. We have to be very careful in how we do it. But I couldn't go as far as to say that those inconsistencies aren't probative to whether you really believe what you're saying or not.
Viola, one of the things that I find really interesting is in a state like New York, we have a very large Jewish population where we have tons of rules and regulations that are actually put in place to assist many religious organizations. I'm still a little surprised that even from a state perspective that we've seen this decision. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because sometimes local rules and regulations seem to carry the day, especially as it relates to culture and custom, but it looks like maybe New York is pushing back on this a little bit.
Well, they could be, but we were in a prior program. You all discussed the matter of religious freedom in states across the country, and New York was at the bottom of that list, and it's leaning more toward popular culture today. And that's where the rub is here, I think.
And one thing I think, and Tim, I got to ask you this: when you hear an institution that has a title, for example, where Yeshiva really has a clear proximity to the Jewish and Hebrew faith, that it seems as though that a little bit of just common sense and maybe looking at this, as you juxtapose what Todd was talking about regarding violence that took place decades ago, that there could have been some really just general common sense stepping in on this. And it seems like that might be missing in this case here.
Right. I think common sense would de-escalate a lot of these situations, but people don't always exercise common sense. And so I think that these kinds of conflicts, legal and cultural, are probably going to continue around the edges. I think it's in the best interest of Orthodox Jews and others who have similar views of sexuality to try to find as much common ground as we can on these things. But we have to know that those things are not going to ever go away, because they're real conflicts, and those lead to legal clashes.
Todd, let me give you the last word on this. One of the things that you pointed out, maybe there are a lot of religious groups that need to be taking some time to look at some of the things that they've done from a business perspective and start reevaluating, or even going back and truing up some documents so that they can better be protected. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, putting items into your bylaws and making clear your religious mission is something that I think all, schools of faith or schools that want to maintain a religious identity need to do. I mean, it seems pretty clear what Yeshiva University was trying to do back in the 1960s was sort of separating out sort of, the explicitly only religious trainings to be a rabbi from the secular training, or I shouldn't say secular training, but from the training that was designed for, say, a secular profession, and they were separating those out. Nothing wrong with that. You can have a religious school that prepares people to work in the business world, to work in secular jobs and still be a religious school. But, what seemed to have happened is they didn't really maintain that religious aspect of in it, at least in their corporate documents, like they should. And these documents, often after they're done, they just kind of sit there and no one looks at them. So yes, that's absolutely something schools need to be looking at, and many have.
And I think it's really clear that we make that point, that understanding that churches are also nonprofit organizations, and making sure your documentations are in place to ensure your consistency, or to make sure that people do not determine inconsistency, is a good way to go forward. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
I think the way Indiana crafted and drafted their RFRA statute killed the RFRA statutes for other states.
Wow. Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I was going to say something similar, except I think it only killed it for about 4 years. States started passing RFRAs about 2 years ago, and I think they're going to start doing so again. But the reason is because they've untethered RFRA from the fight about gay rights, which it never should have been about in the first place.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
We shoot this around the holiday time, and if you have a December birthday, according to a recent study, you will get on average 160 fewer presents over your lifetime.
Wow. Just broke my heart. Justin, tell me something I don't know.
Since I'm on here with Tim Schultz, I can't leave this aside. The Cowboys will not be going to the Super Bowl, just in case you didn't know.
Guys, want to thank you for our show today, and that was some great information, and I'm with you on the Cowboys. Thanks for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.